Hi everyone, Rose here. For many of us who were one of Jehovah's Witnesses, the steady flow of new publications, magazines, books, brochures, they felt like visible evidence that Jehovah's chariot was moving forward, providing constant new spiritual instruction. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, now commonly referred to as the Watchtower Organization, was closely tied to its printing operations for nearly a century. But over the last 2 decades, something significant has happened. The printing presses have largely stopped, publications have dramatically decreased, and many of the properties once used for printing have been sold. In 1950, the printing plant at 117 Adams Street in Brooklyn occupied an entire city block. In 2004, the last printing press in Brooklyn was shut down, ending 84 years of continuous printing there. By 2013, the factory complex was sold. And in 2026, only one new public issue of the Watchtower and one new issue of Awake will be produced. This video is going to trace that shift from expansion to consolidation to liquidation using the organization's own publications and publicly recorded documents. In 1926, the organization moved its printing operations into a reinforced concrete structure at 117 Adams Street in Brooklyn, New York. What began as a single factory building expanded rapidly. In 1946, an enlargement of the printing plant in Bethel home was formally announced. Excavation began in December 1948. Construction followed in January 1949. When it was completed, the 9-story addition nearly doubled the available floor space. By 1950, the printing plant occupied an entire city block in Brooklyn, New York. Printing was not something happening quietly behind the scenes then. It was central to how growth was measured, the number of magazines produced, the number of books released, and the expansion of facilities was presented as visible evidence that the work was advancing. By the 1980s, circulation of the public magazines had reached extraordinary levels. The Watchtower itself reported circulation of more than 11 million copies per issue, and the Awake more than 10 million copies per issue. At that scale, hundreds of millions of magazines were being printed each year. Those numbers were often announced in meetings and printed in the yearbook as evidence that the work was expanding. For some families, including mine, printing wasn't just distant. It touched our everyday life. Boxes arrived from Brooklyn, New York. The publications were counted, they were bundled, and then they were put in our magazine slots. Publications were then placed door to door. Subscriptions to the Watchtower and Awake were sold. The literature had set prices that we would pay at the literature counter, where we would go to get the publications to use out in service. See, all witnesses paid for printed materials, whether they were placed or not back then. Printing meant our preaching. It meant participating in what we believed was God's message being carried forward. In November 1969, the organization purchased a 13-story reinforced concrete structure from the Squibb Pharmaceutical Company. The building was converted into offices, further expanding the organization's presence in Brooklyn. And by this point, the Brooklyn complex was no longer just a printing plant. It had become an interconnected network of factory space, offices, and residential buildings. For some families, including mine, Brooklyn was far more than a location on a map. In the 1950s and 1960s, my uncle worked in the printing facility, bundling publications together. In the early 1960s, my father drove around Brooklyn and neighboring areas delivering publications that had just come off the presses in Brooklyn to local congregations. Decades later, in the 1990s, my brother served in Brooklyn as well. The printery wasn't symbolic to us. It was part of our family history. And we saw the expansion reflected in the printing numbers that were regularly announced and highlighted in the meetings. A significant shift began in the early 2000s. In June 2003, the organization announced that one of its major Brooklyn properties at 360 Furman Street would likely be sold. On April 29, 2004, the last printing press in Brooklyn was shut down, ending 84 years of continuous printing there. According to the 2005 yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses, printing, binding, and shipping operations were consolidated at Wallkill, New York. The bindery closed shortly after. Floor space was reduced. Personnel was reassigned. And I remember when the printing shifted. See, Brooklyn had always been the center in my mind. My uncle had worked there, my dad had worked there, and my brother had worked there. I remember thinking, Brooklyn is where it's always been. The governing body was still there at the time. So why move the presses if Brooklyn was still the center? I remember that was the first time I quietly asked myself, why? Well, in the June 15, 2010 issue of the Watchtower, it was announced that Canada would soon begin printing most of the magazines for the United States and Canada. The report described newly installed presses operating double shifts, up to 16 hours a day, resulting in a 10-fold increase in magazine production at that branch. Printing capacity had expanded, but it wasn't centered in Brooklyn anymore. And I remember when I read that, again, Brooklyn had always been the center, the hub, the world headquarters in my mind. The organization was still presenting Brooklyn as the center of the work, and I couldn't make sense of it. Why move the printing to Canada? It felt different from anything I had known growing up, and to be honest, it bothered me. But I pushed the thought down. I told myself, there has to be a reason, and I moved on. At the time, I didn't realize those changes were part of a much larger shift that was just beginning. You see, in July 2013, the organization announced that it had signed an agreement to sell a complex of Brooklyn buildings. The agreement was signed on July 5, 2013. Over the next several years, Long Hill properties were sold, including factory buildings and residential facilities that had defined the organization's presence in Brooklyn for decades. By 2018, the final Brooklyn property listed for sale had closed. When the factory complex was sold, it connected the pieces for me. The printing had already moved, the presses had already stopped, and now the buildings themselves were being sold. What had once occupied an entire city block in 1950 was no longer part of the organization's footprint in Brooklyn. For decades, publications were not only central to preaching, they were also tied to the organization's funding model. Subscriptions were sold, literature had set prices, and the congregations paid for the printed materials whether they were placed or not. In practice, the large-scale production and distribution of publications was the primary way the organization generated consistent income for much of the 20th century. In 1990, the organization discontinued the long-standing system of set prices for literature and subscriptions, moving instead to a donation-based model. And from that point forward, literature distribution was no longer tied to a direct purchase price. Over time, the organization's financial structure continued to evolve. In 2014, another significant adjustment was announced regarding Kingdom Hall construction and financing. Congregations were informed that existing Kingdom Hall construction loans would be discontinued. Instead of repaying individual loans for their buildings, congregations were asked to pass a resolution committing to a regular monthly donation to support Kingdom Hall and Assembly Hall construction worldwide. In many cases, the suggested donation amount was similar to what congregations had previously been paying toward their construction loan, but the arrangement applied more broadly than that. You see, congregations that no longer had an outstanding loan, including those whose Kingdom Hall had already been fully paid for through local donations and volunteer labor, were also asked to adopt a monthly resolution contributing to the worldwide construction program. Now, for congregations that had already finished paying for their buildings, this meant that a regular monthly payment now continued even though the original construction costs had long since been satisfied. Around that same period, ownership of Kingdom Hall properties was gradually transferred to centralized organizational entities rather than remaining under local congregation control. For many congregations, those buildings had been constructed through local donations and volunteer labor. We helped build them. Congregations maintained them. Many had already paid off the construction costs years earlier. For many witnesses, the Kingdom Hall had always been described as our hall, something the congregation had built together. Imagine owning your own house. You paid for it. You did all the work, and you don't owe any more payments. Then the homeowners association comes to you and tells you they're going to do you a favor. They're going to assume ownership of your home, and all you have to do is send them a monthly payment. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Now, imagine they did that to everyone in your neighborhood. Well, that's exactly what happened worldwide. In some cases, this transition created tension at the local level. One example occurred in Menlo Park, California, where elders reportedly resisted selling their Kingdom Hall when the congregation was directed to merge with another. According to court records and reports at the time, the elders who opposed the sale were removed and replaced, and control of the property ultimately shifted to the organization. Now, situations like this illustrated how ownership and decision-making authority over congregation properties had moved away from the local congregations and into the organization's centralized corporate structure. Over the past decade, many Kingdom Halls and branch properties around the world have been consolidated, merged, or sold as part of the centralized property structure. By 2018, 37 Brooklyn properties had been sold since 2004, according to the organization's own reporting. For much of the 20th century, the organization's financial model centered on large-scale publication production and distribution. Today, that model looks very different. For someone who grew up associating spirituality with how many magazines I placed at the doors and hearing printing numbers increase at meetings as proof of growth, I began to notice when that emphasis changed. There was a time when we were given clear personal goals. 10 magazines a month, 90 if you were pioneering, 100 if you could. The more you placed, the more faithful you were considered. So when placements were no longer emphasized the same way, when magazine output decreased, when new releases slowed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. In 2026, only one new public issue of the Watchtower and one new issue of Awake will be produced. Additional issues are reprints from prior years. A century ago, an entire city block in Brooklyn was devoted to printing. New books were released every year. Conventions meant new publications. Printing numbers were announced and celebrated in the meetings. But today, the presses in Brooklyn are silent. The buildings have been sold, and the rhythm is different. Instead of printing facilities, the organization is investing heavily in media production centers and is increasingly producing digital media. Video production now takes place in studios at locations such as Patterson and Warwick in New York, as well as regional branches around the world. And a new media production campus known as the Ramapo Media Center is currently under construction to expand that work even further. This reflects another shift in how information is produced and distributed. For decades, many of us who were one of Jehovah's Witnesses, printing once felt like proof that the work was moving forward, proof that growth was visible. And when that changes, that rhythm changes, it's natural to notice. Sometimes our questions don't start with what we are taught. They start with something much simpler. I hope this video resonated with you somehow and maybe showed you something that you didn't realize before. As always, please keep searching for truth, for understanding. Take care of yourselves and stay strong. And thank you very much for being here.
That we can honor or show respect and appreciation for Jehovah with our valuable things. Another misimpression that has been brought to our attention is that the sale of property in New York City means that fewer donations are needed. To help put things in proper perspective, however, selling one of the significant properties in New York really only covered the operating expenses for the worldwide work for a few weeks. Now, that's one significant property. And in actuality, the sale of property in New York City is basically only financing the construction of world headquarters in Warwick and the...
Well, we are happy to announce that on Wednesday, July 17, the Warwick Planning Board unanimously approved the site plan for the new world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses.